Hello, my name is Alva Bailey. I'm a writing and multiliteracy tutor at the WMC, the Writing and Multiliteracy Center here on campus at Channel Islands. I've been with the WMC since 2021, so it's been 4 years for me working there, and I really enjoy what I do, and I'm excited to be here to talk with you all about plagiarism, citation, and paraphrasing in ASA style. Now, if you would like to follow along or access this presentation later, you can find it through this tiny URL here on the first slide. So, please feel free to refer back to this as much as you need. So firstly, just the agenda for today's presentation. First, I'm going to just do an overview of plagiarism, what it is, how you can avoid it. Then I'll talk about citations in ASA style specifically, so some of the common issues that we see and, things that are difficult to catch. There's a lot of tiny details. Then we'll go over paraphrasing, what it is, sort of like the best practices for it. And then we'll close off with a paraphrasing exercise so you can kind of put your skills to the test and make sure that you can identify what good paraphrasing really looks like. So first things first, plagiarism. So plagiarism is defined as the practice of taking someone else's work and passing it off as one's own. So obviously we're all discouraged from this in school. We're all familiar with this word, but sometimes I think people are unsure about like what kind of work counts within this definition. So work can mean a lot of things. It could be the published writing or ideas of somebody. So that could be books, articles, handouts, blogs. I think we're all a bit more familiar with this. But it can also be unpublished writing. So it could be from notes, that like you got from somebody else. It could be student writing, one of your peers. It could even be an email, right? If you had like an email correspondence with somebody and you're using their ideas, if you don't cite them, that still counts as plagiarism. It can also be from speeches or talks. So, a professor's talks, or presentations in class, or, in the community, speeches. These all also count as somebody's work. And then lastly, of course, we have images, photos, films, sound files, music, etc. So anything visual or audio that is produced by someone else that is copyrighted would definitely fall under this realm of work that if you don't cite it, it would be plagiarism. So at CI, we do have a plagiarism policy. It states academic dishonesty includes such things as cheating, inventing false information or citations, plagiarism, and helping someone else commit an act of academic dishonesty. It usually involves an attempt by a student to show possession of a level of knowledge or skill that she does not possess. So here we can see, right, that plagiarism does constitute a form of academic dishonesty because, right, we see here it's that idea that you're trying to pass off something as being your own work or your own knowledge when it isn't. So there are three types of plagiarism that we can talk about today. So the first would be if, for example, you submitted an entire paper that was not yours, you just took somebody else's assignment from, your friend took it last semester and you just took their same paper, changed your name and submitted it. That would be plagiarism for sure. I think that we would all know that though, right? We probably all are aware that submitting someone else's entire paper would definitely count as plagiarism. But it could also just be from sections of a paper that aren't your own. So for example, right, if you just like went online or, you found a journal article and you just cut and paste entire sections or entire paragraphs from that other work and put it in your own without citation, that's definitely plagiarism as well. But lastly, and this one I think is where people sometimes get a little bit more tripped up, is when you paraphrase without citation. That also counts as plagiarism because what you're doing in that circumstance is passing off those ideas as your own. Just because you've put it into your own words doesn't mean that the idea itself is yours, and so you still need to give credit to the original author. So the way that we can avoid plagiarism is by citing our sources. So you use proper citations whenever you're using information that you gain through an interview or conversation, right? As I mentioned before, like sometimes it's these informal communications. It might not be a published work, but you're still getting these ideas from somebody else. So you'll want to make sure that you give them proper credit for that by citing them. When you use exact words or a unique phrase or term that belongs to an author, sometimes authors will coin really specific turns of phrases to talk about something. And in those cases, anytime we're using somebody else's exact wording, we definitely want to make sure we're citing it, right? Because those are not our words. You also want to make sure that you have a citation whenever you're paraphrasing, right? So as I just mentioned, just because you kind of put it into your own words doesn't mean that the idea itself stemmed from you. And so you want to make sure that you're giving that credit when you are paraphrasing somebody else's ideas. And then lastly, whenever you're using diagrams, charts, photos, or any other graphics that you did not create, that do not belong to you, you want to make sure that you're citing where you got it from in order to avoid plagiarism. So something else to keep in mind about citations, in addition to, ensuring that you're not plagiarizing, they're really important because they boost your credibility, right? It's showing that it's not just me who's saying this, right? There are other people who have studied this subject or, others in the field who this is what they think, this is their consensus, and that you can point to exactly where you got that information. So it makes what you're saying more credible. It also shows that you've done your homework, right? It shows that you've read up about this topic, you've looked at a lot of different sources for it, and that, you have a good grasp and understanding because you can cite all of these different sources of information. And lastly, it's really awesome because it helps your readers find whatever works you used, Sometimes you might only be able to talk about a small portion of a paper, but your reader, like that might be something that's really interesting to them. And so they'll want to know, like, where did you find that? Who was talking about this issue? And if you cite it, your reader can actually go ahead and like follow through with that. They can find it in the references list, and then they can go and find that source themselves, and they're able to access it. So it really helps, boost your credibility, but also making the information more accessible to everybody. It helps you remember where you got it from, and it helps your reader find that information as well. So let's talk now more specifically about ASA citations and style. So ASA is the American Sociological Association, and it's in the 7th edition, and that's what this presentation is on. So I'll be going over some of the guidelines that are provided in the ASA manual. So some of the most frequent problems that we see, at the Writing Center when we're working with students is these here. So we have in-text citations because they have a very specific format that is a little different from APA. And so people, I think a lot of people are familiar with APA. Lots of classes and fields use it. So maybe we're all more familiar with that. And they're not exactly the same. They do have their distinct qualities. So in-text citations are one of those points of difference. The references list entries are also different, especially with the formatting of the DOI. So I'll talk about that. And then lastly, the formatting of numbers, like when you're giving a page range. ASA also has really specific guidelines for how those should be formatted. So I'm going to talk about that as well. So before I jump into all of this, because it might be like a little bit overwhelming, all of this information about these really tiny details for formatting, I want to let you all know that the WMC does have style guide resources available for free on our website. So you can go to our page linked here, cscci.edu/WMC/student-resources. And you can find all of our style guides. Basically, we have quick style guides for MLA, APA, ASA, Chicago, ESA, and others. So always feel free to go and check those resources out if you are ever stuck in citing in ASA or any other style. We probably have something for you. And if you look at the guide or we don't have what you need, you can always come in and make an appointment at the WMC because we have access to the full manuals for most of these styles. So we can actually help you dig in if you have like a really strange or unusual source that you're using and you're not sure how to cite it. Come in and we can work with you to figure out what the best way to do that is. Okay, so here's some updates from ASA 7th edition. So ultimately, the basic citation rules remain the same in ASA 7th edition, but some changes. So instead of using he or she alone as a generic third person singular pronoun, it's preferred to use they when you're talking about somebody of an unspecified gender. They also don't want you to put a hyphen between African American or Asian American. Just keep them as two separate words. And then there are some like terms, like kind of culturally insensitive terms that they don't want you to use unless it's for a very specific purpose, like it's relevant to the context of your discussion or it's in a quotation perhaps. Otherwise, you want to avoid using these terms because they just aren't really like appropriate to use anymore. Okay. So next, now that we've kind of covered some of the style updates, let's talk about the citations. So first, I'm going to talk about in-text citations, some of the basics. So this it's listed here as parenthetical citations, and so that's referring to those citations that are in parentheses, in the text. So that's what I'm talking about when I say parenthetical citations. So if the author's name is not explicitly mentioned in the text, right? So, maybe you're just giving the information, you're giving the data, but you're not actually mentioning them by name, then you would provide the author's last name, the date of publication, followed by a colon and a page number if that's relevant, right? Like if you're quoting like a really specific statistic, then you're probably going to want to put in a page number there so that the reader can identify exactly where that information came from. Some other like tiny details about this to keep in mind, there's no comma between the last name and the year, right? It just goes last name space year. And there's no space between the year and page number. So it might look a little strange to you, but it just goes, year, colon, page number. There's no spaces between those elements. So here you can see this example of Friedman, space, 1992, colon, 43. And 43 is the page, and 1992 is the year. And of course, those are in parentheses because this would be a circumstance when we aren't naming the author in the text. However, if you do use the author's name in the text, what you'll do is just provide the year after you say their names. So in this example, right, it's Sylvia, Delaney, and Markovich, 2007, and then ... right, whatever their information was, whatever they shared. So it's pretty straightforward so far. So when you have 3 authors, we have some more special formatting for how you would handle that in text. So what you'll do is you'll write out all of the authors' names that first time that you're citing them in text. So like in a parenthetical citation, right? So in subsequent citations, though, you're going to use the first author's last name. So whoever is listed first, you'll use their last name, and then you'll use the abbreviation et al. And et al stands for et alia, and that means and the others. So you never want to use it when you just have 2 authors because it doesn't make sense, right? You can't just, if it was just Lee and Grossman, you wouldn't say Lee et al. Because and et alia can only stand for more than one person. So you would have Lee and Grossman in that case, right? If it was only 2 authors. Anyway, the other thing that I want you to take note of is that you write out the word and between authors in ASA. In APA, you use the ampersand, the little like swirly and symbol, but you don't use that in ASA. So here you can see in this example, Lee, comma, Grossman, comma, and Carey, 2004. That would be the first time you cite them in the text. And then the next time, and all times, after that first one, you would just say Lee et al. 2004, and we know that the et al. Is referring to Grossman and Carey. Now, when you have 4 or more authors, no matter what, you're going to just use et al. In the text. So you'll just put the first author's last name, et al. in these situations with 4 or more authors, right? Because if you have maybe, some papers have 10 authors on them, that would take up a lot of room in the text if you had to write out everybody's last name that first time around. So you can just bypass that when you have 4 or more authors. Okay, so next, let's talk about citing page references in text and in the references list. So this is very tricky in my opinion. So I would recommend, like don't bother trying to memorize this even. What you want to do is just make sure that you know where to find the resources to get this information. So this is also available on our website under our ASA quick guide. So if you're ever unsure about how to cite page numbers in ASA, check out that resource because this same chart is there for you, and so it can help guide you. But basically, in ASA, they kind of like to reduce repeated numbers in certain circumstances. So for example, you'll see this, right? This first box here, it's pages 132 to 48. But what it really means is 132 to 148. It's just that we can assume that it means within the same like 100 range, right? So you wouldn't want to write out 132 to 148. You're just going to drop that first one. Similarly, in the second box, you have, 1,102 to 11. And so we know that means to 1,111 in this context, but you just don't write out the full thing. However, there are exceptions to this, which is where it gets tricky. So in the case of 102 to 106, because there's a 0 in this second place, you actually have to write it out in full both times. So you can't just do 102 to 6. Kind of the same thing over here. In this next example, you need to write out all the numbers for 1,101 to 1,108. You have to write it out fully. And then down here, like when you're in numbers like, in the tens, basically like 12 to 15, you have to write it out fully. You can't write just 12 to 5. So this is kind of tricky. And so if you're like unsure about this or don't know what to do with this in your own work, come into the WMC and we can talk about it and we can look at the guide together and help you figure out the correct formatting for the numbers. But I would not expect you to memorize this. I certainly don't have it memorized. I just know where to find this information. So just keep that in mind. All right, so now moving forward, let's talk about references. So before we were talking about in-text citations, right? So in the body of your paper, how you would be signaling where that information came from. But now we're going to talk about, what would be at the end of the paper, basically the bibliography, right? But in this case, we call it references. So this is where you're going to have the full information about a source, as opposed to just the author's last name and the year or page number. We're going to have everything available for your reader. So for books, important things to keep in mind, you're going to italicize titles and capitalize the first letters of nouns when you're looking at the book title. So here in this example, Impossible Subjects, Illegal Aliens and the Making of Modern America. That is the title of the book. It's italicized and all of the nouns are capitalized. When you're citing a chapter in a book in ASA, you use quotation marks around the chapter title and you follow that up with a page number as well, like the page range for that chapter. So here in this example, we see in quotation marks, farm worker food insecurity and the production of hunger in California, period, and close the quotation marks. And then you start off with the pages. So, right, pages 121 to 46 in Cultivating Food Justice, etc. And you see here the title of the book is italicized and the nouns are capitalized. So next, let's talk about the formatting in the references for journal articles. So in journal articles, in ASA, the author's first name is written out. So if you're familiar with APA, you know that you don't ever write an author's first name. You use their last name and their first initial. But in ASA, you do use their first names. You also will be including the issue and volume numbers, followed by a colon and the page range. And then you're going to drop those repeated numbers like we talked about. In most circumstances, there are those exceptions. But right, like if our page range is 135 to 152, you format it as 135 to 52. And then the last point that I want to mention here is that you'll use DOIs when available. So the DOI is a digital object identifier. Most journal articles have these nowadays, and they are specifically tied to, one particular article. And these are really helpful because they're stable. And so like everyone can access them. It will always lead you back to this same source. Unlike sometimes, if you're using like a database link, sometimes it makes you like sign in or it doesn't quite work the same. Maybe not everyone can access it, but with the DOI, it's more accessible and it's more stable. And so it's preferred when this is available. And most articles have it. So if you are looking for it and you're not sure where to find it, that's something else we can help you with at the WMC. You could come in and say, I need to cite this, but I don't know where this information is. And we can help you like identify it and learn how to find it. So here in this example, you can see some of these points that I was just mentioning, right? We have two authors in this case. So the first author, their last name is listed first. So Bergerson, Albert, and Max Herman. So that's something else. It's a quirk of ASA. Only the first author's names will be listed in like inverted order, last name, first name. All of the other authors would be listed first name, last name. And then, of course, I wanted to draw your attention to the volume and issue numbers. So the volume in this case is 63. And it's immediately followed by the volume number, which is 1 in parentheses. So there's no space between the 63 and the parentheses around the issue number, excuse me. And then there's also no space after that closed parentheses. It goes straight to a colon, and then again, no space. It goes straight to the page range 135 to 52 in this case. And of course, as I mentioned, the DOI. So the way that you format DOI in ASA is you just have in all lowercase the letters DOI followed by a colon, and then the DOI is typically a string of numbers, maybe some letters in there. And so you insert that, and then you put a period at the end. And the period at the end is unlike APA. APA doesn't have that period at the end, but ASA does. So, right, it's just like all these little details that make ASA unique and make it ASA. All right. So now that we've gone over, the kind of recommendations for style in APA, or excuse me, in ASA, and we've talked about, how to do in-text and reference citations, we are going to shift our focus now to paraphrasing. This is like the last half of this workshop. So just to get started, I want to highlight the differences between paraphrasing and summary, because I know it can be kind of confusing for people, especially, when you're like just getting started on paraphrasing. It can seem like, well, what's the difference? But there is a difference. So in paraphrasing, we're restating a section or part of a text in our own words, whereas a summary is a condensed or brief account of an entire text or concept. Similarly, in paraphrasing, it's often used for clarification, and it accurately highlights particular and specific ideas, whereas a summary would accurately reflect the overview or big picture ideas. So really, the main difference here between the two is that paraphrasing is about, retelling very specific ideas, specific points in your own word, whereas a summary is about like, what's the overall message here? What's the gist of this whole text? Whereas paraphrasing is focused on a specific portion of a text. So I want to talk now that we have a better understanding of what paraphrasing is, how it's different from summaries. Let's talk about quotations versus paraphrasing. So in paraphrasing, right, as we just established, we're restating the author's ideas in our own words. And it's commonly applied to convey concepts, ideas, and information obtained through a range of sources, right? So when we're paraphrasing, we might actually be incorporating information from multiple sources at once. So we might end up having our citation at the end. It might actually be listing multiple sources. Whereas quotations or direct quotes are used when the author's exact words are essential for the argument. So I think that's something important to keep in mind, right? They're essential for the argument. It's preferable to paraphrase. If you're just, using quote unquote, 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 like where are you in there? Where are your ideas? It's not coming through. So we don't want to rely heavily on quotations. We want to use them sparingly and make it really deliberate when we are using them. So when we're using quotations, it requires the use of quotation marks around the text that belongs to the author. So sometimes key terms are quoted in paraphrasing as well, right? Like if you're paraphrasing this idea, but they have a really specific term they use, it's okay to use that specific term. You just need to make sure you're putting it in quotes to make it clear that it's distinct from your paraphrasing, right? Like that's a direct quote in your paraphrasing. But the thing that both of these have in common is you still need to cite no matter what. You need to cite the original source, whether you're paraphrasing or whether you're using a quotation. So I have an example here of a paraphrase. So I'll go ahead and read it aloud, and then we'll talk about a second version of this. So this says, as long as traditional sociological views of Mexican Americans are held, the social advancement of the people as a whole is impossible. Quote, escape is possible for individual members of a subordinate group if one is more Caucasian in appearance or if the culture and values of the larger society is adopted. Miranda, 1994, 24. In other words, if Mexican Americans attempt to pass as Caucasians. Okay, so this is one attempt at a paraphrase, but let's look at another version of this same paragraph. As long as traditional sociological views of Mexican Americans are held, the social advancement of the people as a whole is impossible. Alfred Miranda, 1994, further notes that such views not only make racial passing more appealing, but also inevitable if one is to succeed in the United States. He argues, quote, escape is possible for individual members of a subordinate group if one is more Caucasian in appearance or if the culture and values of the larger society is adopted. 1994, 24. In other words, Mexican Americans can attain the American dream, but only if they pass as Caucasians. So what makes this revision better? I mean, right, the original also included a citation, it had a quote and it cited it. So why might we consider this second example a stronger example of paraphrasing? So think about it for a moment and then I'll kind of dive in. Okay. So there are a few reasons why I think this second one is a stronger example of paraphrasing. So here, first off, we see that the author of this second paragraph is paraphrasing Miranda's idea of racial passing. Right, so they're explaining this idea of racial passing in their own words, whereas in this first example, there was no introduction to it, there was no mention of it really, it just went straight into the quotation after that opening sentence. And here we see that the writer used the narrative citation, so that's what it's called when you use the author's name in the text. So they used the author's name in the text and they still put the year in parentheses, right? So it's really clear whose ideas these are. They aren't trying to make it sound like their own. They introduce it as Alfred Miranda's idea, right? Then another thing that I think makes this stronger is that the quotation isn't just thrown in there, right? In the first example, it's just suddenly a quotation without any sort of context leading into it. However, in the second example, the quotation is anchored by mentioning, again, like referring to the author, saying he argues. And then you use that quotation as evidence, as opposed to having it stand alone and trying to carry all the weight of this paragraph or this paraphrase, right? We're actually using the quotation as evidence. Then, at the end of this quotation, they've got the citation once again. So they have the year and the page number. They don't actually even need to say, oh, excuse me, they don't actually even need to say the author's name again because they already made it clear who they're referring to by leading in with he argues. And so we know it's from the same source. It's referring back to the same person. And then lastly, they restate the main idea of the inevitable, what is inevitably needed to do in order to succeed. And they're paraphrasing it, right? Instead of simply just throwing out a quote and sort of leaving it at that, they're actually explaining a bit more about what it means, right? This first one, it just says, if Mexican Americans attempt to pass as Caucasians, but this one is more precise in saying, right, it's that attempt to attain the American dream, but only if they pass as Caucasians. So it makes a lot more sense because it's more fleshed out, and it's clear that the writer in this case really understands the ideas that Miranda was putting forth because they were able to communicate it back in their own words and use his quote, right, this powerful quote, using that as evidence as opposed to relying on it to do all of the work and explain everything. So that leads us to discussion of what is effective paraphrasing. So an effective paraphrase will represent the original source accurately. And that's really important, right? You need to make sure that whatever way you're saying it in your own words is still reflecting the same basic idea that the author put forth. Effective paraphrasing also will not repeat everything in the original source, right? You don't necessarily need all of the information that somebody's talking about. It could be a 15-page journal article that you're referring to, and they might touch on a handful of topics, but you're only focused on one of them. So you don't need to include information for those other unrelated topics. You want to make sure you're focused in only on the relevant information for your paper. And then, related, you're going to leave out that irrelevant or unimportant material and only focus on the best, most relevant points. So again, even if, the whole paper is about your topic, you don't necessarily need to give every single piece of evidence that author did. You need to decide, okay, what is the most important? What's the best for me to use in my paper, and really focus in on those. You don't need to try to cover everything. You just need to be able to discern what is most important and what's most relevant for you to be restating in your own words. So we're gonna close this off with a little paraphrasing exercise. So it's obviously not going to be quite the same because this isn't live. Otherwise, I would be asking you guys for your input on what you think the correct answers are. But I'll try to give you a moment to really think about it and try to plan it out before I go into my explanations. So what we're going to do in this exercise is we'll first read the original passage, and then we're going to read a paraphrase of that passage. I'm sorry, a few paraphrases of that passage. So then we're going to determine, okay, there will be 3 paraphrases. One is good, one is inaccurate, and one borrows too much. So a good paraphrase will be one that is accurate in representing the original and also puts the material in words different from the authors, right? Those are 2 of the key components. Those are the key components of a paraphrase. It needs to be accurate and it has to be in your own words, different from the authors. The second category would be B, and that's if the paraphrase is inaccurate in its content. So it distorts the source quite a bit, right? It might be in their own words, but what it's saying does not accurately represent the information conveyed in the original source. And then lastly, in C, this would be a case where the paraphrase borrows too much of the original language. And at that point, it's plagiarism. The wording is not different enough, and it's just plagiarism, right? So let's go ahead and look at this first example. All right, sorry, I have to move my little camera out of the way. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and read this original quote to you first. So it says, the product, Calban 3000, has not been approved by the FDA for marketing. The agency also contended that Calban's labeling was false and misleading and did not bear adequate directions for use. According to these and other reports received by the FDA, 10 people who used Calban were hospitalized because of esophageal or intestinal obstructions, and 1 person died of a blood clot that reached the lungs shortly after surgery to remove a throat obstruction. All right, and then we have the source here underneath. So that's the original quote that we're looking at. This is the original section of a paper that we want to paraphrase. And so down here, we have 3 different attempts at paraphrasing it. And we're going to determine which one is the good one, which one is inaccurate, and which one borrows too much. So I'll go ahead and read out each of these and give you guys a moment to think about how you would categorize each of these paraphrases. So the first one, according to Tom Kramer, 1992, the majority of people who took the diet product Calban 3000 suffered some kind of severe or life-threatening physical injury. This next one, the FDA argued that the labeling for Calban 3000 products were incorrect and deceived consumers. And then lastly, Calban 3000 was not approved by FDA before being released for marketing. Its labeling was false and misleading. According to investigators' reports in FDA Consumer, 10 people who used Calban were hospitalized because of esophageal or intestinal obstructions, and 1 person died even of a blood clot that reached the lungs shortly after surgery to remove a throat obstruction. All right, so these all have citations in there, but not all of these are good paraphrases. So take a moment to look at this and determine how you would categorize each one of these. And if you need more time, you could even pause if you would like to take more time. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and now let you all know what I think, how I would categorize these. So see if you agree with me. So the first one, I would categorize as B, inaccurate, right? It says, according to Tom Kramer, the majority of people who took the diet product Calban suffered some kind of severe or life-threatening physical injury. Now, what part of this makes it inaccurate? Right? It says the majority of people who took it. That's not true. That's not what the original source said. The original source said 10 people who took it experienced these negative side effects, not the majority. So that's an inaccurate representation, and that means that's not a good paraphrase. So what about the next one? The next one I would classify as good, right? This one just says the FDA argued that the labeling for Calban 3000 products were incorrect and deceived consumers. So in this case, right, we don't necessarily need all of this information, all of this context that's provided from the original source. Perhaps the only thing we need to hone in on is the fact that the FDA, found that these products were not labeled correctly. And so this person, in this second example, they've successfully, synthesized these ideas, right? That it hadn't been approved by the FDA and that these findings about the labeling, were problematic, right? It wasn't accurate. So that leaves this last one as C, borrows too much. So I think that's no surprise to label this one as borrows too much, because it is almost word for word following along with the original source, and it's even following it in structure, right? Like the order of the sentences is exactly the same as the order of the sentences from the source material. It's only slightly altered. Almost all of it is from the original source. So in that case, this is plagiarism, right? Because you framed it as a paraphrase, but what it actually is it's more akin to a direct quote, right? So we want to make sure we avoid that. It's borrowing far too much. We need to find that balance where we're only honing in on the information we need to share, that we want to summarize, and that we're making sure we're really putting it in our own words, that it's distinct from the original source. So let's look at another example. This one's a little shorter. So I'll read the original source material first, and then we'll look at the paraphrases. So this first one, so the original source reads, the growth in children's advertising has been driven by efforts to increase not just a current, but also future consumption. Hoping that nostalgic childhood memories of a brand will lead to a lifetime of purchases, companies now plan cradle-to-grave advertising strategies. Okay. So now that we've read that, let's look at the paraphrases. So the first one reads, Hoping to brand purchases with nostalgic childhood memories, companies plan cradle-to-grave strategies to increase current as well as future consumption. The second reads, as Schlosser notes, advertisers focused on cradle-to-grave advertising toward children in order to nurture brand loyalty from an early age. And then lastly, the cradle-to-grave advertising strategy, which Eric Schlosser endorses, focuses on brand loyalty that lasts throughout a consumer's life. So once again, I'll give you a moment to think about this. Pause if you would like longer. Okay, I'll go ahead and give my feedback on these. So this first one, I would label as borrows too much, right? Hoping to brand purchases with nostalgic childhood memories, companies plan cradle-to-grave strategies to increase current as well as future consumption. I mean, it's almost exactly the same wording in some cases, right? They've sort of just switched the order a little bit, but that's not enough to make it their own words, right? It sounds a lot like hoping that nostalgic childhood memories of a brand will lead to a lifetime of purchases. Companies now plan cradle-to-grave advertising strategies, right? And it's even kind of pulling from the first sentence a little bit as well, but ultimately these are all just the original author's words, just sort of like mixed around a bit, and that does not constitute paraphrasing. That's still plagiarism. The second one, though, I would consider a good paraphrase, right? It says, as Schlosser notes, advertisers focused on cradle-to-grave advertising toward children in order to nurture brand loyalty from an early age, right? I think that that's a pretty good, clear-cut, and straightforward summary, or a paraphrase more specifically, of what this, these couple of sentences were saying, right? Like that's the big takeaway. They didn't necessarily have to talk about, the nostalgia or anything like that. Maybe that's not relevant to their paper. They were able to just focus in on, this is the big picture. This is what, the advertisers are doing. So then that leaves this third one to the inaccurate category, right? So this one says the cradle to grave advertising strategy, which Eric Schlosser endorses, focuses on brand loyalty. So I would say that I do not at all get the sense that he endorses this from reading the original source material. It doesn't at all sound like he endorses it. And at no point does he say, like, I support this or I believe this. So it's inaccurate to say that the author is endorsing it or that they support it. That's just a misrepresentation of the information they provided. So, come back, revisit these if you would like to kind of get a sense of what good versus bad paraphrasing might look like. But I hope that this activity has been kind of fun. I quite like it. So with that, I just want to remind you all that we have our citation resources page at the WMC. You can, go check it out and find our ASA style guide, quick style guide. It is there. It will have a lot of information that I covered in this presentation. And, it has lots of examples of what it will look like when you're citing different sources. And of course, if you ever do need extra help or you're not sure, you can come visit us at the WMC and we're more than happy to work with you and, find those answers alongside you. So there we go. I jumped the gun a little bit, but here you go. It's easy to make appointments with us. If you want to find out more, just go to our website, www.cscci.edu/WMC. You'll find our hours, you'll find all of our tutors, and you'll find all these different ways to make appointments. You can meet with us, virtually via Zoom. You can drop in. You don't even have to have an appointment. You can just drop in. You can meet with us, in person. If you come up to the WMC, we're on the second floor of Broome Library, straight to the back. You can come drop in there and make an appointment. And you can also make an asynchronous appointment through VoiceThread, but I wouldn't recommend that if you want help with like citations or things like that. I think it's easier if we can just sit down and talk and, problem solve together. But do check out our website. We have more information there. All right, and then these are my references. So thank you for your attention. I hope that this has been helpful for you all. And, I hope you'll come visit us. All right.